Good evening. It is wonderful to see everyone this evening. Glad we can be together to worship and stay together. We are in the final section, at least for a little while, of our look at history on Sunday nights. We're going to be transitioning to a different kind of still class type style, a different kind of topic soon, which I'm really excited about, and I'll give a little more detail about that probably next week. But we are continuing in on this series, wrapping it up for now, with a look at a couple of events that are after Jesus. Most of what we've looked at so far, from a historical perspective, we've been looking at things leading up to Jesus. We looked at different nations that rose and fell, leading up to kind of the intertestamental period, as we sometimes call it, the period between the Testaments. We looked at some of the things that happened between the Testaments, in particular, things like Alexander the Great and the kind of splintering of his nation or his empire after that. We looked at the Maccabean Revolt and a lot of different groups within Jewish society that formed during that time, like the Pharisees, Pharisees and Sadducees and others who were active during that time. So we looked at all that kind of stuff leading up to Jesus. But now we're going to look at something that happens after Jesus, that Jesus himself predicts, and that is an extremely relevant historical event that happens after that, that has a great impact not only on Jews, but also on Christians in kind of an associated way. If you remember, then last week we talked about we talked about Samaritans, rather, and we talked about tax collectors and how these two were, in many ways, the untouchables. We talked about how these were ones that you couldn't associate with on so many different levels. But as we look at kind of where all this leads, we talked a little bit already in our introduction to the book of Hebrews that ultimately even the untouchables had a place where things were going, because the Jews were about to need everyone on their side as certain events began to transpire. We're going to talk ultimately about the revolution that would come after Jesus against Rome that would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and of the Jerusalem temple, which, by the way, has never been rebuilt since then in Jerusalem, even though there have been many desires and many attempts to do so. So we're going to talk about that for the next two Sunday nights because there's a lot to cover here. Tonight we're going to talk about the beginning of the revolt itself, and the next week we'll focus more specifically on the actual siege and fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. But as we're talking about this tonight, and as always, in these things, please, questions, comments are more than welcome. As we're talking about these things, I want us to think about what we've talked about to this point with Jewish culture as it had evolved up until, Jesus, and then just after Jesus, as we're talking about here. This is maybe 30 years, give or take, after Jesus has ascended back to the Father when these events begin to take place. But think about what we talked about for the last 200 years. The Jews have already had a history multiple times of glorifying revolutionaries. You think about the Maccabean Revolt as the kind of centerpiece of that. That's how they think things get done. You start a revolution. And there's reason for that, right? Even in the Old Testament, were there ever times where you have what amounts to a revolution? Think about, for example, the Judges. Someone comes in and oppresses Israel, and God raises up a judge, and what does that judge do? Essentially, they rebel against the occupiers, right? So this has precedent. However, what's the key difference between someone like a Samson or a Gideon and someone like Judas Maccabeus? Is there any difference between the two? Why did Gideon and Samson and the others rise up and start this revolt against their oppressors? Because they were told to by God. They were appointed by God to lead this effort to drive out the people who had enslaved them. But of course, that's in the days when God is preserving the nation of Israel. What's happened by the time you get to the Maccabean Revolt? Well, yes, a remnant has come back, but ultimately, God has already kind of telegraphed, if you will. He's kind of already given a heads up, hey, you're not really going to ever get back to what you used to be. You gave that up when you decided to follow idols, and I allowed the Assyrians and the Babylonians to take you into captivity. And nonetheless, the Jews still think they can do this on their own. And we've talked at length, when we talked about the Maccabees in particular, that the Jews, because of this history over these past 200 years or so before Christ, they're expecting the Messiah to be one of these same types of revolutionaries. This is how things work in their minds. This is how they've come to think about it. Once again, I hope we see some parallels with our own culture. If you want to get things done against a tyrannical government, what is enshrined in our culture? How were we founded? A revolution, right? Now, granted, our society and our government will be quick to say, but we're not anywhere near that extreme. Well, that's a whole other story, right? We're not anywhere the extreme of tyranny to justify that kind of thing. Well, I would argue that Christians should always be very careful about justifying any kind of revolution, but that's a whole other discussion. The point is, the Jews had gotten in their minds, this is how we make sure we have what God has promised us. This is how we make sure we get the blessings that we're supposed to have as God's chosen people. We make sure that we follow revolutionaries when they rise up and are ready to get things done. And one day we'll have the ultimate revolutionary who's been prophesied by God, and he'll come and set everything straight once and for all. That's how they're thinking. So, Jesus comes on the scene. And people begin to say, oh, wow, this guy's powerful. He can perform amazing miracles. Oh, wow, this guy teaches so authoritatively, even beyond the scribes and the Pharisees. Could this be the Messiah? And they begin to think he's claiming to be the Messiah. He's referencing these prophecies as if he is the Messiah. And, of course, even his inner circle, the disciples, believe, all right, this is it. We are right in here. We are the first ones at the door, if you will, ready for the Messiah to start his kingdom. Remember Peter, absolutely dead set on the fact that the Messiah is going to set up an earthly kingdom. First, rebukes Jesus when he says he's going to die, because Peter's convinced, oh no, you can't die, because that's not what the prophecy says. The prophecy says you're going to start an earthly kingdom. No, it doesn't, Peter. But, that's how he had his mindset. And then when Jesus is arrested, he draws a sword. All right, this is it. The revolution begins. This is going to be just like when Mattathias killed the priest for trying to offer the profane offering, right? And Jesus is like, nope, that's not how we're doing things. Once it becomes clear that Jesus has no intention of being a revolutionary and establishing an earthly kingdom, because of where the Jews were in their culture at this point, is it really any surprise that they decided at the trial of Jesus to release the revolutionary and put to death the peacemaker? Now, you might not have ever thought of Barabbas in that way, but if you look at the wording that's used for Barabbas and the description that's used for him, usually it's translated something like robber in our English Bibles, but the idea is more of a brigand or of a highwayman or of someone who essentially lives outside the law. Maybe we think of like the Wild West, right, an outlaw. But usually that has the connotation, although we can't be 100% sure, it's very likely given all the circumstantial evidence, usually has the implication of someone who's kind of conducting an underground guerrilla warfare against those in power, in this case Rome. He's called a murderer. Well, remember what we talked about? That group called the Sicarii, part of the Zealots, how they would just casually murder people who were cooperating with the Roman Empire? It's probably pretty close to the type of guy that Barabbas was. So already the Jews are kind of letting the world know, if you will, hey, if we have the choice between a Messiah who's all about a spiritual kingdom and a guy who liked slitting people's throats in the name of freedom and revolution, we're going to pick that second guy, right? Shouldn't be a surprise. And that's where they double down as things move forward. Ultimately, as we see history progress, it should remind us, and it's kind of one of these tragic history repeats itself situations, it should remind us of something that happened way back at the beginning of Israel's history. Anybody remember when Israel first gets to the edge of the promised land under Moses? What happens? What happens next? They get to the edge of the promised land. Moses has led them from Egypt all the way there. What happens next? Do what? They revolt. Why do they revolt?
Because they haven't reached their destination. They don't see the end.
Well, that was at a different time. They're at the edge of the promised land. What do? They're told God has given us this land, but what do before they go in?
Send out spies.
They send out 12 spies. And what do those 12 spies come back and report?
10 of them say they're too big, too many.
Essentially, 10 of them say, we're not up to the task. We're going to be absolutely slaughtered if we have to fight these people. 2 of them, of course, Joshua and Caleb, disagree, say God's capable of doing anything. We usually stop the story there, but does anybody know what Israel does next? Oh, yes, they mourn and they're upset, and they get on to Moses and Aaron, and they say we should just go back to Egypt and all that, but then God says, you're going to be punished. You're going to have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Anybody know what happens next? They try to go in themselves. They say, oh, never mind. We're ready. Let's go in. And they go to battle. And guess what? They get stomped. Because they were partially right. On their own, no, they didn't have a chance against the Canaanites. God was the one who was going to fight their battles. But once they took matters into their own hands and tried to do things their own way, God wasn't fighting for them anymore. That was so long before Jesus' day, but that's ultimately what's about to happen. The Jews have set their minds, the only way this gets done, the only way we become a free nation again, is if we take matters into our own hands, we revolt against Rome, and we do it ourselves. That's the only way this happens. And they were so convinced of that, they weren't going to listen to any alternatives. So what's coming? Well, ultimately, they are going to revolt against Rome. That's what we're looking at tonight. Remember, again, the Sicarii and this habit of violence and what we would call terrorism. After Jesus' death and after his resurrection, that increased. Now, not it increased because of Jesus' death and resurrection. It just increased. That kind of thinking, that radicalized kind of thinking, for whatever reason, there's several reasons really, that began to become more and more popular, more and more justified in the minds of the average Jew at the time. More and more as the years came and went and no Messiah that fit their ideas showed up, they began to think, well, this is what we got to do. Maybe the Messiah will show up if we kick things off, right? Maybe a hero will rise after we actually take that first step and start the fight. And so you get more assassinations. You get more terrorist attacks. It's a reasonable description. No bombs, obviously. They didn't have that technology, but it's the same type of thing, same type of tactics. And ultimately, it gets bad enough that Rome becomes harsher and harsher with the Jews, which makes the Jews madder and more likely to be violent. And you can see where this is going. But I want us to notice something. If the clicker works. There we go. Jesus knew exactly where this was headed. Jesus knew where this misguided zeal was going to lead. And so as we're thinking about the beginnings of this revolt and kind of seeing the direction it's going, I want to think about a few things that Jesus himself predicted because he wanted his followers to know ahead of time what was going to happen so they wouldn't get involved. Remember what Jesus tells his disciples, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, but my kingdom isn't of this world. But he knows that not everyone can accept that some people are going to try and build a kingdom of the world, and he doesn't want his people to join that fight, including, for example, as we talked about already in our introduction to Hebrews, including the people that the Hebrews writer is writing to. So what does Jesus predict? I want us to focus on a couple of statements of Jesus that he predicts what's going to happen in the 30-so years after his death. This is in Matthew 24. Now, those of y'all who were able to make it to the end of time lessons that we had at Wheeler, if you weren't able to catch those, I go into a little bit more detail, although there's still limited time for that. But we talked for about an hour about Matthew 24 and a lot of the different elements of that Jesus is talking about here. Ultimately, the majority of Matthew 24 is not talking about anything like the end of time, as some people sometimes assume. Most of it is Jesus warning his people about what's going to happen in the next 30, 40 years, ultimately culminating in this revolt against Rome that will end in tragedy. So notice what he says. We're just taking excerpts here to try and kind of get a picture. See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Now, first of all, what does Christ mean?
Anointed one.
Anointed one. It's not a name. It's not Jesus' last name or anything like that, right? It is a title that literally means anointed one. It's the Greek version of the word Messiah. Messiah in Hebrew, Christ in Greek, right? So many people, he's saying, will say, I'm the anointed one. In other words, I'm the next Judas Maccabeus, right? I'm the one the prophets have predicted. I'm the one who's going to lead the revolution. Many are going to say that, Jesus says. And they'll get a following. They'll lead many astray. If you have a society and a culture at this time that wants a revolution, well, if someone comes along and says, hey, I'll lead one, everyone's like, yeah, let's go. So they'll lead many astray. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Interesting that he adds the rumors in there, right? A lot of times, I think about, for example, the Cold War. How many times were there rumors of wars within the Cold War that never actually materialized, right? But there was tension. There was a whole lot of tension. And sometimes there were actual wars, proxy wars between, for example, the East and the West. Think about Vietnam or Korea, things like that, as well as other ones in Africa and so forth. See that you not be alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. I want us to notice something in the book of Acts. Acts is Luke's historical account of the events of the church growing in between the time of Christ and the Jewish revolt. This period that Luke records for us in Acts takes place pretty much from the end of Jesus' ministry and his ascension into heaven, pretty much starts there and ends at Paul's death, or rather a few years before Paul's death, which is right on the cusp of this revolution beginning. So it's this time period. There's some interesting things in the book of Acts. Notice in Acts chapter 5, this is when Gamaliel is trying to convince the Jews, we don't need to go full throttle against the Christians right now because it'll die out if it's not anything. Notice what he says. Before those days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people. Now, if you look at the timeline here, if my understanding is correct, he's talking about things that happened just after the time of Christ. Now, I could be wrong on one of those. One of those might be before, but I believe at least one of these occurs after Christ has already ascended. It's interesting. We have external historical records about these two individuals that are named, Theudas and Judas. Yeah, those rhyme. I never thought of that. We have historical records of those two. They did, in fact, lead revolts, claiming to be somebody. Well, what somebody do you think they claim to be? Well, maybe a chosen one, someone who God had appointed to lead the fight against the invaders, the oppressors of their people. So we see already some things materializing that Jesus had predicted. But not only that, we see something else in Acts that I think is very interesting. In Acts 21, this is when Paul has just been essentially arrested, although it's unclear exactly what's happening at this point. It's chaos. The Jews have gotten mad at him. The Romans have stepped in. They've taken him aside. And the Romans, specifically the Roman official, I believe he was a centurion, if I remember correctly, he asks him, he says, wait, you're speaking to me in Greek. He's surprised that he's speaking to him in Greek. He says, I thought you were that Egyptian guy that led a revolt and took a bunch of assassins out into the wilderness. I thought you were that guy. Now that one did happen after Jesus. We're confirmed on that one. And he believes that, this Roman believes that he's got the guy. There's confusion again and chaos. Of course, Paul explains, no, I'm not that guy. I'm Paul, blah, blah, blah. But there had been another revolt, or another attempted revolt in this case, an Egyptian leading 1,000 men, or 4,000 men rather, the assassins out in the wilderness. Guess what the Greek word for assassin is here? By the way. Sicarii, yes, it is. Sorry, did I cut you off? Okay, yeah, the Sicarii, the group of Jews that we've just been talking about, the assassins that would go in and stab people in the back of the crowds. So what's the point here? Jesus said, hey, guess what? After I leave, there are going to be a bunch of people rising up and saying, I'm somebody you should follow. Or perhaps even I'm the anointed one, the one who's going to start the revolution. And we see, both in history as well as in the book of Acts, which is history in and of itself, but I mean extra-biblical history, history outside the Bible, we see both from that and from the Bible itself, that happened. But if you notice what Jesus said in Matthew 24, the end is not yet. Well, in Acts, that's happening, but we're not quite to the revolution yet. Let's see what else Jesus says. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. If you had to sum up the condition of the church in the book of Acts, what are some words you might throw out there? Do what? Tribulation, persecution. We can also think on the positive side, right? There's a huge amount of growth that the church experiences during the time period that Luke records in the book of Acts. But in part, they grow because of the persecution, which we've talked about before in a different context. So ultimately, once again, this fits right in. First, we have the persecution that arises after the stoning of Stephen. Stephen is the first one we're aware of, besides, of course, Christ, but he's the first one we're aware of that is put to death by the Jews for things related to Christianity. And so we're told after that a great persecution arises against the church, to the extent that most people have to leave Jerusalem. And even they have to leave Jerusalem, they're scattering all throughout the countryside because of this persecution. Well, that fits Jesus' prediction. We also see not only this scattering and this general tribulation and persecution, and not just Stephen's martyrdom, but things continue to escalate violently. Herod kills James, just outright puts him to death. And he tries to do the same thing to Peter, although God miraculously intervenes in his case. A great deal of persecution, a great deal of tribulation. But once again, as we see the timeline Jesus is giving us, these things lead up to what's coming, but we're not quite there yet. Ultimately, what's going to kind of kick things off comes after all that. But do you see how this already kind of gives the church a roadmap in a sense. We talked in Revelation, right, about how kind of the churches that are being written to in Revelation kind of are getting a sense of what's coming. We talked about even this morning a little bit in Daniel that God's people are getting a sense of what's coming. Well, that's standard procedure for God, right? Here we have once again Jesus giving his followers a little bit of a sense of what's coming. He's letting them know there's going to be uprisings in kind of minor uprisings, if you will. But we're not quite there yet. There's also going to be tribulation and persecution of the church. We're not quite there yet. Ultimately, it's after those things have happened, and we're kind of like, okay, what's next? Well, next, we see the actual revolution kick off. We'll talk about that more next week. But I hope we're seeing something here. We're seeing this idea of radicalization. We're seeing the Jews continue to try and start something that they have decided is what God wants. As we're going to see in Hebrews, as well as throughout the New Testament, but especially as we look through the book of Hebrews on Wednesday nights, this is the opposite of God's plan, meaning revolt. This is the opposite of God's plan for his people. But the Jews are convinced this is what they need to do. It is a tragic mindset. Because what we see ultimately is the culmination of a people who refuse to let God do things his way. It's a cycle that keeps repeating. God's people, and we're talking about the Jews right now in this case, God's people throughout their history consistently make the mistake of not doing things the way God wants them to do them, of trying to take things into their own hands. And ultimately, this is kind of the final step where God says, all right, you do what you want. And the Jews say, okay, we're going to. And it's going to end in one of the worst tragedies the world has ever seen, and certainly I would say the worst tragedy that the Jewish people had seen up to this point. Absolute chaos, absolute destruction is going to ensue ultimately because of this rebellion, and they'll even try another one a few years later after this one, and that will even wipe them out further. All because they just didn't want to do things God's way. They believed they had a better answer. Something that fit their wishes, their desires, their mindset better. That's a lesson. As several New Testament writers tell us, the things that happened before, they were written down, they're recorded for us for our learning. That's what history is. I was talking with Carrie earlier, I guess it was last night, about some different things I've been reading in one of my history books just for fun, because y'all know I'm a nerd. There's so much in history that's there because we can learn from it. Whether we're talking about the Bible or just history in general. And we ignore the lessons of history at our own peril. If there is anything we can help y'all with this evening, as always, the Lord's invitation is open. We always want to make sure you know that. It doesn't have to be something that you make known to everyone, but if you do have something that's going on, even if you want to just speak to someone in person, privately, whatever the case might be, we just want you to know we're here to help. We're here to encourage and strengthen one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. If there is something we can do, please let us know as we stand and sing.
Years I spent vanity
Vanity and pride,
carrying on my Lord.